What's up, and welcome to Complete Nonsense, where we take the latest news and trends and show you the money side of it. We're your hosts. I'm Lindsay DeMuno, and this is my amazing friend and colleague, Ben Richardson. Here with us today is Alex Gailey, Bankrate Senior Data Reporter. Alex, we're so excited to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, Alex, it is awesome you're here with us. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to be talking about some of the recent trends in remote work, the rise of the 4-day work week, and probably one of the most taboo topics, which is salary transparency, which I'm excited to dive in. But before we do so, please make sure you like, share, subscribe, comment on whatever platform you're tuning in from. But Alex, let's go ahead and jump in. Let's talk about remote work. How has remote work influenced the preferences and expectations of the younger generation?
Absolutely. I mean, remote work is something that was really born out of the pandemic, or we saw sort of a significant push for remote work because everyone had to stay home, everything shut down. This was largely affecting Americans who do have white collar jobs, who can do their work from home. And really, overall, we see that time and time again, the data showing us many Americans prefer remote work, but you do see younger generations prefer it at a higher rate. I think the idea here is kind of like the cat's out of the bag. Now that younger generations have been exposed to remote, or even if you want to broadly put it, flexible work, they don't really want to let go of it. And so I think what's interesting, though, overall, is that more so than even remote work, I think younger generations, what they want most is really just work flexibility, and that looks very different for different people, right? But we have done our own research here at Bankrate and have found that overall, the majority, I mean, I'm talking nearly 90% of Americans want some sort of flexible work option. So that could be a 4-day work week, that could be remote work, hybrid work. So overall, we're just seeing that there's definitely I guess you could say, like, something that people really want in the workplace and are continuing to ask for in the workplace. In terms of how, I guess, companies are responding or trying to evolve to these work preferences, we have seen more of a push to return to office mandates this year. But you are seeing companies, kind of trying to meet in the middle, requiring workers to maybe come in 3 times a week, 2 times a week, and then working remote.
Kind of that hybrid work schedule.
Yeah, but I do think this is still a hot button topic. There's still a lot of people that say, no, I don't want to go into the office. I want to work remote. So I think there is still a lot of tension there. I think there's still disconnect there with companies and employees. And really, I think the broader question at play is, I think people are sort of wondering, was work from home a pandemic only phenomenon? And I don't think it is. I think, we're in a moment of flex. We're continuing to see changes in the workplace, especially as technology gets more advanced. And overall, I think, older generations are maybe a little bit more open to going back to how things used to be. They used to work a certain way. They were in the office every day. They were used to 2-day work weeks. But, we see millennials are the large majority in the workforce. We know Gen Z is going to start taking up a big portion of the workforce. I think by 2025, it's like 27% or something like that will be Gen Z workers. So, they are going to be heavily influencing the workplace really in the coming years. And we'll see a lot of shifts overall.
Well, I think it's so interesting because during the pandemic, I think it shifted the way people think about life. I think the things that people began to value, it shifted. And I think that's where remote culture allowed people to have a little bit more autonomy with their time. And, whether it's time spent on commutes or things like that, it really shifted people's perspectives and the values shifted. So it's really an interesting conversation. And Alex, I think it's interesting you bring it up that I do think it could be something that's here to stay. And I don't think the conversation's necessarily going away anytime soon. So
yeah, I definitely don't think it is. I mean, like you said, I think COVID one of the silver linings from COVID was that it really forced people to be introspective and to think about work-life balance and have a new perspective on their lifestyle and their career. And I do think one thing that came out of the pandemic is people really are valuing work-life balance a lot more. They're valuing time at home with loved ones, even just doing like leisure activities. And so I think you're seeing that play out in the workplace. And, hybrid and remote work really allows for that flexibility and that better work-life balance. I mean, you both work from home. What do you think? Do you feel like, it's a better work-life balance? How are you, I guess, perceiving that versus maybe being in the office before? I mean, I only worked in the office for about a year and a half before COVID happened. So it's really interesting to think at that time. I didn't think that even remote work was an option ever. I didn't even know it was possible.
For sure.
And now, I am working remotely primarily. So
Lindsay, you speak to that first.
Yeah. Well, I was in the office prior to being fully remote. And I just remember the biggest time suck was the commute, because I would be commuting from New Jersey to New York every day. Like my bus would take a round trip would take almost 3 hours plus the subway. So I got back all that time after switching to remote. So the biggest benefit for me has just been getting my time back and being able to just kind of wake up an hour later, kind of do everything that I want to do without having to worry about getting on the bus, wondering if I'm going to be late for work today. Is the bus going to be on time? Like that is the biggest benefit for me. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I don't deal with buses and trains and stuff here in North Carolina the way you will in New York. It's interesting. Like even my prior employer, I began remote work prior to joining here at Bankrate, and but prior to that, my entire life, a much older generation probably than you guys. So, but like I've been in the workforce for a long time, and so going really to a remote schedule was very unique. I'm a pretty extroverted person, so I would say one of the things that was difficult is like I did miss some of the camaraderie you get from the office, but I also found that I was much more efficient in my time because I probably wasn't spending time at somebody's desk, small talk or the water cooler talks, as some people talk about. And so cutting out some of that allowed me to be more efficient. Some of the flexibility has been, it's been really helpful, like from the commute standpoint. That's certainly been a benefit. And then I think also the flexibility of like, it's the little things. It's like even when my kids get home from school, even though I'm working, like I can hear them outside playing, I can see them. And so there's part of that to me as a, I consider myself a younger parent, like that's valuable to me. And that's something that I never take for granted of. So for me, there are certainly benefits. But again, there are pros and cons, the camaraderie. Thankfully, technology has evolved much where we can do things like this, where we're, on video and being able to have these conversations to connect, but certainly wasn't it wasn't an easy adjustment. But once you've kind of settled in and learned the guardrails and parameters around remote work, it's really been a beautiful thing. I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of also being able to save on costs, potentially, saving on the commute, for example, the costs that go into that, eating out more when you're going into the office every day or frequently, even being able to potentially live in a cheaper city, or, maybe you can save on childcare a little bit, potentially by being home more, and being able to, juggle caregiving responsibilities with work. I know with a lot of working moms that I recently spoke to for a story, a lot of them are working remote or hybrid because ultimately like that flexibility is so essential as a working mom, especially a mom with young children, and just having that flexibility to be able to juggle the caregiving responsibilities and work, so they don't feel like they have to give up, one or the other ultimately.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, Ben. What do you think are the biggest advantages or disadvantages to remote work right now?
Right now, I think the biggest advantages are you do get that better work-life balance. I mean, in that same sentence, though, I do think it's harder to unplug from work sometimes when you're working from home all the
That's
time.
true.
Like, where's the separation, right? So, I mean, I caveat that with, overall better work-life balance in the sense that you get more time back from maybe not having to commute, or maybe, not having to do other things that involve maybe more time with going into the office. But at the same time, if you're working at home, you might not be able to unplug as easily. I think another big pro from getting to work remote is saving money on gas or commuting or takeout, being able, again, maybe having the option to live in a cheaper city. Maybe you have a job from a company based out of New York City, but you're able to live in a lower cost state or city somewhere else in the US, and so you're able to save on money there. Saving time not commuting, that's a big one. I believe I read some research that said the average American was spending about 55 minutes commuting. So that's a lot of time back in your day. And I mean, Lindsay, in your particular situation, sounds like you got a lot of time back by not commuting. Even just ability to potentially focus better on individual tasks. So tasks that don't require you working in a group, having that focus time, not having any distractions. There's also, I think, research that shows, improved mental health, maybe for people who experience anxiety or maybe feel imposter syndrome in the workplace. Maybe they're a little bit more introverted and they feel like working at home makes them feel more comfortable in the workplace. And they have, still the ability to connect over Zoom or digitally, but maybe they just feel more at ease at home and getting their work done. So I would say those are a couple big
I think that's good. And I think you bring up a valuable point, because I think one of the challenges for me as an extroverted person was that, I wasn't getting that same camaraderie for a while. And so it requires a lot more intentionality in getting it other ways to make sure that, that for your mental health, it's still something that's important. And so like complete isolation, I don't think is a good thing. I think people need people. And so for me, I've had to find other ways to get that. That you might traditionally get in an office. So there are definitely pros and cons. Do you think there's any potential impact for remote work in terms of like potential career growth and development for young professionals?
I do think that working from home can possibly hinder, networking opportunities, especially if you're just starting out your career. There is like that camaraderie, like you said, in the workplace, and just being around your colleagues all the time, that you kind of just build that up very naturally. I think when you work from home, you have to be very intentional, like you said, Ben, with making sure you're making those connections, having those network opportunities over Zoom. So I do think it can be, it's a balancing act. I think to an extent, I mean, young workers, that maybe remote work is all they know. I mean, for speaking from my own personal experience, I've worked remote now longer than I worked in the office. So I did have a little bit of taste of that, but now I've been working remote for several years. And so it might kind of just be all they know. And I do think the younger generations, like, they grew up with social media, they grew up with constantly being connected to people. And I think that they have found really creative ways to stay connected, to feel like they're building up their network and reaching out to people, and hopefully, progressing their careers and development that way.
Yeah. I know too, like a big thing that came out of this remote work was the new model of the 4-day work week. And in a recent Bankrate survey, we found that 83% of Gen Z and millennials supported the 4-day work week. And 48% of those say they'd work longer hours to make a 4-day work week happen. Do you think that the 4-day work week model is here to stay, or is this something that might not come to the US? I know it's popular outside of the US right now, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a lot more popular outside of the US, but I would say never say never. You never know. I know I've seen a couple of features and articles of different companies in the US experimenting with it. And yeah, I mean, you never know. Again, the workplace is evolving and changing. And if that's what young workers want, then employers need, they need people. Ultimately, like, the job market is actually in a good place right now. And so, if that's what young workers want, like, I think employers will have to adapt and shift and change, especially if they want to sort of like win the war on talent or get the best talent. They're going to have to accommodate for these evolving preferences and changes. I do find the 4-day work week model so interesting. I don't know. I guess personally, I don't have a hot take on it necessarily. I mean, I think, like working, I guess you could work longer hours, but then you'll have a 3-day weekend. Yeah, I don't know. I think I would have to almost like test it out to see if I like that
Yeah.
better or not.
Yeah.
I think maybe just more research needs to be done on that, and understanding, does that ultimately contribute to a better work-life balance? Does that, overall improve morale or create less stress in the workplace? And yeah, I'm very interested to see how that model sort of plays out in the next coming years.
Yeah, I remember reading an article a while back about some companies. There were a lot of companies in the UK that had tested the model, and I want to say 92% of the companies ended up retaining the 4-day work week model. And so I thought it was a really fascinating thing. And I think there's advantages, disadvantages. If you're talking about some blue collar jobs, right, where maybe it's in landscaping or you're in construction, and there's different types of job fields. A 4-day work week might have its disadvantages as well, but there are jobs that certainly might accommodate it. I love the idea of a 3-day weekend every weekend. That's more time with your family. It's the same concept of remote work as like, balance of like work-life balance. I think sometimes realistically, once you're in work for the day, like your mind's there, and it takes so long to unwrap your mind that I'd rather go ahead and get the hours, right away, just because my mind's already there. And that gives you a little bit extra time, maybe for a mental health break. So yeah, I mean, I certainly can see its advantages. I don't know if you guys have a hot take, Lindsay. I don't know if it's something that you love the idea of or not, but I think it's interesting.
I am intrigued by this idea as well. I think like for me, I would love to just work like a little bit longer during the week and then have that 3-day weekend. Like, I don't know if I would prefer it to be like the Monday off or the Friday off. I feel like it would have to be a test to see what is better, but I feel like I get majority of my work done. Like I could do it in less days, but do the same amount of work with more hours. Like I feel like it could be beneficial and
Yeah,
just make
10-hour
me more
work days wouldn't
productive.
bother me.
It
Like
would
I
not
think it would
bother
be
me.
fine.
Yeah.
I can pull that off 4 days. In fact, I could probably make it 12 hour days and still be okay. I mean, there's a lot of people who already do this stuff. I mean, we've
Yeah.
got nurses and, a lot of people in these different fields that are already working those schedules. So, I don't know if this framework, I've heard a lot of people say that, the American work day of the Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 was a thing of the past. It was back when, in the early days of the industrial revolution, things like that were all causes of it. So I'm not a history buff, so I'm not going to dive into that, but it's just interesting. Like, as we evolve, we've got to evolve. Alex, as you said, like attracting the best talent may require more competitive benefits, whether it's remote work, hybrid work, or 4-day work weeks. That may be, a real consideration in attracting the best talent.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting because I've seen actually two versions of this model. I've seen it be, where you work longer days, so you still get 40 hours a week, but you're only working 4 days. And I've also seen where you're just actually still sticking to like maybe a 9 to 5, but so you're just not working as many hours. So I think there's kind of different approaches company could take there. As long as I think your workers are sort of being productive and getting their work done, if your workers can get their work done in less than 40 hours a week, like it could be interesting to see how it plays out in the workplace.
For sure.
Yeah. And I just want to like, how do you think society's perception of remote work has changed over the last few years?
I think before the pandemic, it was seen as a foreign or uncommon concept. I mean, I know personally speaking, I didn't even know it was an option that you could work remote. It just didn't even cross my mind. Like when I got my first job out of college, I was like, okay, I mean, I have to go in the office every day, right? So I think society was sort of forced to embrace remote work because of the pandemic when everything shut down. And I think what happened is during that time, people kind of had a wake up moment or an epiphany, and they realized, oh, okay, I actually can be productive and do my job from home. And so I think, again, it was just a big wake up call in the workplace. And then again, I don't think this is something that will go away. I think this is here to stay in terms of, in general, flexible work. It's not just a pandemic only phenomenon. People have realized that they can continue to do this on a day-to-day basis. And, again, that it's definitely, it's changed how young workers perceive work. And they definitely continue to want that flexibility.
Well, Alex, I'm curious, like, how do you feel like working remotely, like, can make a young professional more productive? So, because I mean, we have some young professionals entering the workforce who may not even have had a lot of experience in the workforce, whether being in office or whatever. And so, what are some of the ways that remote work you think right out of the gates could add some value from productivity for the next generation?
I mean, I think people have to figure out what works best for themselves. Sometimes that does mean leaving your house to do work. Sometimes that means like your best work is done at home. And, overall, there's kind of been mixed research around productivity at home. There's been some research that says remote workers are more productive. There's been research that shows they're more productive in the office. So there's a lot of conflicting data out there right now. But I think you have to, as an individual, figure out what works best for you.
For sure.
But they kind of speaking more, I guess, anecdotally with people that work remote, overall, they do say they feel like they have better morale. It feels like there's a better sense of trust between them and their employer, knowing that, their employer trusts in their ability to get their work done, be productive from home. So I think that trust part is really big there. And yeah, I mean, having trust, feeling like you're trusted by your employer is huge, and that boosts morale. That potentially boosts productivity. You feel energized to get your work done. And yeah, I think that all those factors are really playing into potentially like how productive workers are at
And
home.
I love that you touched on that trust factor, because there is something there that, like, you really feel empowered as an employee when you feel like your employer's in your corner and really like giving you that trust and that autonomy. And I think it's a responsibility that you want to own it. Like when you feel like it's given to you, you want to own it, and you want to prove that value. And so really interesting talk. So thanks so much for your insight there, Alex. It's great.
Yeah. I know that we could talk for hours about remote work and 4-day work weeks, but
Sure.
I want to shift gears a little bit to talking about pay transparency, another important topic in the workplace. I know discussing your salary has been a pretty taboo topic over the past couple generations, but why do you think pay transparency is so important in the workplace, Alex?
Well, I think we've seen such a huge movement with salary transparency in recent years, even at the legislative level. We've seen some laws come out at states. I know in New York, for example, are required to include a salary range and job descriptions now. So you're seeing change happen at the government level, and then you also just seeing change happen in terms of just like day-to-day conversations with people, and even like the conversations that employees may be having with their managers or their HR about pay or salary ranges in their specific jobs. So overall, you've seen this big movement. I think that kind of actually there's a broader umbrella happening with sort of the money conversations. I think we've seen, because of social media, so much more, I think, transparency and openness with talking about money generally. I see all the time on YouTube people doing budgeting videos. I mean, they're going line by line on their monthly budgets, and talking real numbers. I've seen people talk about their student loan debt repayment journeys, and talking again, like going number by number and showing people exactly how they pay down, hundreds of $1,000s of debt. And so I think that salary transparency just falls under sort of that broader umbrella of people being more open about talking with money. And yeah, I don't think it's also like a temporary, I guess, phenomenon. I think it's here to stay. And I think younger generations are really embracing salary transparency, because they know that information is power, and it really can lead to more fair pay, more equitable workplaces overall.
Well, that brings up a question that I had, is like, how can job seekers, I guess, utilize pay transparency to kind of better negotiate their salary?
Well, when it comes to negotiation, information is power. Negotiating is kind of like a dance. And so you want as much data, as much research as possible before you go into the negotiation process, because that is ultimately better leverage. I feel like negotiating is kind of like playing poker. You have your cards, everyone else has their cards, you don't know what each other has, and you're trying to win. And
Show
so
me
I
your
feel
hand, I'll
like,
show you mine. Like,
yeah, exactly. And so I think it's just like one more data point
yeah,
that really gives job seekers a leg up. It helps inform your value. I think I want to remind people that your salary does not define your value in the workplace.
yeah,
It just
that's a good point.
helps inform it. I think, it empowers employees about, what's possible and also what's fair. I think at the end of the day, workers, they just want fair pay. I don't think
Yeah,
workers are out here trying to get $1 million from their employees. They just want to feel like they're getting paid fairly.
that's,
Yeah,
yeah, that's great.
absolutely.
Um, but yeah, I mean, what do y'all think about salary transparency? Is it something that you've come across at all in your own sort of personal experiences?
I
I
didn't grow
think,
up with it. It was very taboo. Like for me growing
Yeah.
up, it was not like my parents didn't talk a lot about money. Like I can't even really recall a lot of conversations around money growing up in general, like whether it was about salary, whether it was about food costs, like it just wasn't really a thing. I'm a huge advocate for the transparency. I think, if there's nothing to hide, let's just be real, right? We all live in this world together. Let's figure out how to navigate it together in a way that's fair for everybody. So I really appreciate even all the influencers. There's so many influencers out right now who are out on the streets having these conversations about salary transparency. And I just huge kudos to them for opening the eyes of people, but also open up the conversation around it. I think it's a great, honest conversation to have.
yeah, I agree with you, Ben. I think over the past few years, I've been having more conversations with friends about salary transparency because, like you said, Alex, information is power. Like, you don't know if you're underpaid unless you talk about it and ask people in the same
Yeah.
industry, like, what you're being paid right now. Like, one of my friends and I have had this conversation multiple times. And after discussing, like, she found out she was severely underpaid in her industry. So she did the research and went back and negotiated her salary because she found out, like you said, by just researching that she was underpaid. So I
Yeah.
think it's important to have, and I think it just depends too on who you want to have the conversation with. It might
Yeah.
not make sense to have it with your coworkers all the time, but maybe if you have a friend that you trust and want to talk about this with, I think it's really
Yeah.
important.
And time and place is important too, right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure like, hey, don't have like horrible performance record and then go in with all, with all this data of like, I need to be paid more, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's certainly something that you need to, tread those waters carefully, but have honest conversations. So
Yeah. You
definitely interesting.
You have to definitely be strategic with your timing when it comes to these conversations. Cause yeah, I mean, although it's being embraced more, it's still there's a lot of vulnerability there in those conversations, a lot of honesty. And sometimes, I mean, there have been times where I've shared that information, but it's not shared back. And I kind of just have to accept that and be okay with that, because I'm kind of went in like knowing I wanted to be transparent. But there are people who, maybe still don't feel comfortable with that, and that's totally okay. Actually, personal story here. I actually ended up switching out of my first job because of salary transparency. I'd
Oh,
been there for a few months, and then had, a pretty honest, open, candid conversation with a coworker there that she was a few years ahead of me, but she was kind of someone I looked up to or thought kind of where I wanted to be in a few years at that point. And we talked about salary. And when I found out how long she had been there and how much she was making, I realized that that's not something that I wanted. And ultimately, I
Mhm.
just felt like I was already kind of feeling I wasn't going to get the career growth and development at that company. But then on top of that, hearing that was a big wake up call. And I realized that I really needed to find somewhere else to go, to really be
yeah.
able to see, those earnings I wanted to see later in my career. Because I remember my first year out of college, like I felt so
Yeah.
poor. And
Well,
I was
yeah.
like stressed all the time about money. And I was like, this can't be my
The
my
real world
fate
right there.
forever. So yeah.
That's interesting though. And it honestly, it is a little bit of, I think, a wake up call to employers, because people talk. The world around us today, people are willing to talk. They're willing to be more open and candid about conversations. And I think it all comes back to fairness, right? So I think that's ultimately what people want. It's what people are craving. It's just an open, honest conversation and fairness around it. But do you feel like, kind of the pay transparency, do you feel like it actually, like, in that case, you were dissatisfied because of the lack of maybe transparency or whatever, but do you actually feel like it would increase and help retention rates to have more open candidness about salary transparency?
I do, because I think it comes back to that trust factor, which we talked about with remote work. It's that building that trust with your employees and giving them information and not sort of gatekeeping that information that
Mhm.
affects their lives every day. I mean, your salary is what is helping you sort of live your life, right? And so I think having even just salary ranges within a company for specific roles is critical and can really help boost trust, and then in turn boost morale, boost satisfaction with the company, employees feel like they're heard, they're valued. And so I do think salary transparency can help with employee satisfaction and overall retention rates.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
You bring up that point about the salary ranges. I think that has been a new thing too recently. Over the past couple months, I saw LinkedIn, are requiring you now to list the salary requirements and ranges for each job, which I think is so important because you don't want to go into a job thinking, oh, I'm going to make $200,000 when in reality it's probably like a $70,000 job. So you just
Yeah.
want to be
Yeah.
open and transparent
Yeah,
about
I
that
think
as well.
there is like a little bit of a caveat with those salary
Mhm.
ranges, because you do unfortunately see employers going, they're putting salary ranges on the job description just to kind of check a box and make sure they're not breaking the law, like in New York, for example. But sometimes those salary ranges can be
Right.
like huge, and you're just like, well, this isn't really helping me, right?
One
So
dollar to $200,000. It's like, okay,
exactly.
cool.
Exactly. So
Based
you
on
do,
experience.
I think it's something that you sort of need to take with a grain of salt to an extent, and you have to do your own research, and that involves, doing your own research online, using, these different websites that offer insight into salaries specifically to your geographic location. I think, if you can have candid conversations with people that are in your industry, or just around you in general, I think that can really be really helpful in the negotiation process. Again, you want to come in there loaded with information, as much information as possible. And one thing that a lot of recruiters do is they will actually ask you, like in an interview, for example, for a job, what is your, like, sort of where are you in the range of, for your, like, what salary are you in the range looking for, or like what do you want to sort of get paid. And I always tell people, like, try not to answer that question, or try to like take the question and like throw it back at them in a way, like be like, if someone's like, oh, how much do you want to make in this role, or what's your salary expectations, I just be like, you know what, actually I was curious to know what your budget is for this role, and sort of what is the range that you can ultimately pay for
Yeah.
a role like this. So I think you don't want to go in and just name a number if
Yeah.
because that could potentially be a lot lower than
Yeah.
actually what they
Yeah.
can.
Well, actually, I had someone tell me a long time ago, and this was, early on in my career, but in the interview process, it's easy to say like, oh, I'd love to make this range to this range. But
Mhm.
another way to approach the conversation was a simple, like, how valuable is this position to the business?
Yeah.
Because then it's helping to understand the value and the effort that needs to go into it. And it really helps to reshape the thinking around it. So I thought that was a kind of an interesting approach to think, not just naming the range, but how valuable is this position to the growth of the business, to the sustainability, which is another interesting way to approach it.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, Ben, because like on that note, I think, companies have to be really intentional with the communication, and like sort of the context of salary ranges if they are going to pursue being more transparent about pay. Like I think companies can't just really like, throw ranges out there without giving more context to maybe the market or the business, and
Yeah.
just kind of having a lot of communication around those numbers. It's not just about sharing numbers. It's really a broader exercise between employees and employers to like create that trust.
Yeah. I don't know why it reminds me of like when fast food companies started having to like show how many calories were in the food. It's just like that transparency, like when that became kind of law, or like every fast food company now, you know how many calories you're getting with each order. It kind of feels the same. Let's just be transparent at this point.
It's depressing when you look at that and see the McDonald's ice cream sundae is like 1,200 calories.
Totally worth it.
It is worth it.
Overall, we love transparency at Bankrate.
We do. Alex, this has been an absolute blast chatting with you. We really appreciate your insight and all of the invaluable information and insight you gave us on pay transparency and remote work and the 4-day work week. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, you've been awesome, Alex. And I thank everybody for tuning in again. I think this is a really fun, open dialogue. I hope you learned something from it. Hope you take something from it. But thanks again for tuning in to another episode of Complete Noncents, and we will see you all next time.